The House will be in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., September 30th, 2023. I hereby appoint the Honorable David Swiker to act as Speaker Pro Tempore on this day. Signed, Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by Chaplain Kibben.
Would you pray with me? Holy and eternal God, when you hear us pray, do we prove as faithful as the psalmist who wrote with confidence, I am always with you? Do we demonstrate our trust in you as the one who with unwavering certainty said, you, O God, hold me by my right hand? Grant us your favor even if we have fallen short in our faithfulness, failed to place our trust in you, or if we have ignored your steadfast presence in these days. Guide us, O thou great Redeemer, through the barren land we have created for ourselves, a time bereft of certainty and muddled with confusion. Uphold us with your powerful hand. Save us from the chaos of our own making, the turmoil of our own design. Strong deliverer, ever be our strength and shield, but especially today and in the week ahead, that we would proclaim with certainty that you are always with us, that we will with confidence go where you will lead us. Fed by the bread of your word and strengthened by the power of your name, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain. The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House the approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, the journal stands approved. Purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal.
The question on the agreement to the Speaker's approval of the journal. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. Ayes have it. The journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the ground that a quorum is not present and make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on the question are postponed. The chair will lead the House in the Pledge of the Allegiance. To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
The House will come to order. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motions to suspend the rules on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The House will resume proceedings on postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5860.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5860, a bill making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2024 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger, and the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 5860, a bill that keeps the government open until November 17th. While I would rather be here speaking on the floor about final appropriations bills, I want members to understand what passing the short-term funding bill today is so important. First, I want to explain how we find ourselves in this situation. Just 9 months ago, when Republicans took back the majority in the House, Our commitment was to regular order for appropriations. No more omnibus measures released in the dead of night. No more Christmas Eve votes on thousands of pages of text that members of Congress have not read. Unfortunately, there were a few stumbling blocks as we sought to change the process. For example, the administration's budget request was more than a month late. It then took months for the president to come to the table on the debt ceiling negotiations. But even before the debt ceiling agreement spending framework was in place, the Appropriations Committee got to work. In fact, this year we held more than 70 hearings. We reviewed roughly 80,000 requests from members. We listened and then we acted. We began markups in May, 5 months ago, and then made adjustments to reflect changes in the law that set spending caps for the year. The appropriations bill moved through the subcommittee, committee, and then the floor. Even though a few bills have more steps to take in the process, I'm proud of the work we've done. As of today, we've sent 4 appropriations bills to the Senate, totaling roughly 70% of funding needed for this year. The Senate has not sent us any bills yet. The House has now laid down a marker on what I believe are our highest priorities. It should be crystal clear to the American people that House Republicans support what is in our national security. Most importantly, we are focused on our troops and our veterans, as well as defending our homeland and our interests abroad. At the same time, the bill we have drafted demonstrates that we must stop government overreach and the out-of-control spending of the last few years. These are the most conservative appropriations bills in history, and we simply need more time to get our important work done. While a continuing resolution is not ideal, it prevents a harmful government shutdown. It gives us more time to pass the appropriations bills on the floor of the House, and it allows us to start negotiations, final full-year bills with the Senate. Yesterday, I voted for a different version of a short-term funding bill that included key border security measures. I strongly support these efforts and will continue to fight for them as this process moves along. But today, the most important priority is keeping government open while we work on full-year appropriations bills that reflect conservative priorities. Passing this bill is the best way for us to move the process forward. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time is reserved. The gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized.
Speaker, we have had 15 minutes to review a 71-page document, a document that was filed before midnight last night. There hasn't been any time for staff to review a 71-page document on such an important issue that we are facing. It demonstrates a lack of responsibility, a lack of a willingness to have a bipartisan agreement on a continuing resolution. I rise in strong opposition to the bill. The day before the government shuts down, and the majority is still throwing anything that they can at the wall to see if anything sticks. House Republicans have already proven that they cannot and they will not pass a continuing resolution on their own, even one with outlandish spending cuts that could never pass the Senate or be signed into law. A bipartisan A bicameral solution is the only way forward. I worked on these efforts. And last December, and House Republicans at that time decided not to participate. But with the Senate Republicans, with Senator Shelby, Senator Leahy, we hammered out a budget for 2023. The Speaker knows the bipartisan Senate continuing resolution would easily garner a majority in this House of Representatives. Yet, he refuses to let it go to the floor of the House. What is he afraid of? So what are we trying instead? Well, yesterday, Republicans voted to defund our support for our allies in the Middle East, including a $1 billion cut to Israel, a further cut to Jordan. That did not work, so today the target is Ukraine. And despite the fact that it is the majority's will, demonstrated several times this week, to provide support for Ukraine's self-defense. The Biggs Amendment that would strike all Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funds from the defense bill failed, 104 to 330. The Gates Amendment that would have prohibited all funding for Ukraine in the defense bill failed, 93 to 339. A Green Amendment to prohibit assistance to Ukraine in the State and Foreign Operations Bill failed, 90 to 342. And this body voted to separately fund Ukraine after it was stripped from the defense bill in the darkness of night, and that was 311 to 117. Mr. Speaker, the appeasement strategy of the far right does not have majority support in this body. Standing with our allies does have support here, which is tried and true American patriotism, American justice, American view and their values for freedom and the fight for democracy. That's who we are. That's what we are about. And those who would do otherwise, shameful in bringing down the United States of America and its support for those people who seek freedom in our world today. The Department of Defense officials recently sent letters to the four corners of the Congress. Undersecretary McCord writes, and I quote, "Without additional funding now, we would have to delay or curtail assistance to meet Ukraine's urgent requirements, including for air defense and ammunition that are critical and urgent now as Russia prepares to conduct a winter offensive and continues its bombardment of Ukrainian cities," end quote. But then he continues, delays to additional funding would also be perceived by Ukraine as a sign of wavering U.S. support and likely a betrayal of our previous commitments. Allies and partners are also unlikely to sustain their increased level of support without clear, continuing U.S. leadership. As you know, Secretary Austin successfully engages over 50 nations every month to press for sustained support. It is crucial that the United States continues to lead this global coalition. Lead. The United States should lead. And we need the resources to underwrite our leadership role, end quote. House Republicans have shown that they are unwilling and they are unable to govern. Some have shown they are willing and they are able to abandon our allies. It is time for this body, for my Republican colleagues, to abandon the Gates strategy or the Green strategy and try, as we have in the past, for a bipartisan strategy that we all know will ultimately conclude the shutdown and fully fund the United States government. A shutdown will hurt families and farmers, children and service members at a time when families are living paycheck to paycheck. Let us keep the U.S. government open. Let us proceed with a bipartisan, bicameral agreement, and as been proposed by the United States Senate, and let us continue to support Ukraine's fight for freedom. Mr. Speaker, let's get to work. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time is reserved. Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Would the gentlelady from Connecticut yield for a question?
Yes, I'm happy to.
Thank you. Do you support the Senate version of a CR?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Strongly support the Senate version.
Okay. So the difference between the Senate version and this version is that this version does not include Ukraine funding. So are you telling me that you would shut down the government if there's not Ukraine funding?
I might just say to you that, and maybe you have had the chance to read 71 pages. This bill doesn't extend the authority to help Ukrainian refugees.
Reclaiming my time.
Of course you'll reclaim your time.
Reclaiming my time.
Gentleman from New York has the floor.
Today, on the last day before a potential government shutdown, Speaker McCarthy will be putting a 45-day clean CR with disaster relief on the floor. I will vote in support of this legislation so that we can keep the United States government funded and open while we finish our appropriations bills. Anyone, Democrats or Republicans who vote against a clean CR with disaster relief is voting to shut the government down. Whether it is Ukraine funding, securing the border, or reducing spending, all of which I support, it will have to be negotiated during the appropriations process. All of us have a responsibility to lead and to govern. In a divided government, none of us will get everything we want. To shut the government down would be disastrous for the American people, our military, and our economy. The time has come for everyone to put the American people above all interests and continue to do our work as responsible, reasonable, and serious legislators. For anyone to vote no on this bill, they are voting to shut the government down. And if you're saying that you support the Senate CR, but you don't support this one, the only difference is Ukraine. And if you're telling the American people with a straight face that you will shut the American government down over Ukraine, shame on you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members are advised to direct their comments to the chair. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I find it very strange indeed that there is no mention of several things, at least preliminarily, which we have looked at in this bill. There are many changes between this bill, as the gentleman asked me, and the Senate bill. There are many changes. The gentleman from New York should understand that there are many changes between this bill and the Senate bill. Here is one that I believe the majority will not mention. They amend the Senate bill to give themselves a pay raise. A pay raise. It's there. Yeah, you can look at me, you can smile, but what you did was you amended the Senate bill to give yourselves a pay raise while you have threatened day in and day out service members, you have threatened workers across this country, and you've said to them, we don't really care about you and whether or not you can support your family. We don't care about that. No. We mainly care about ourselves and our pay raise. And you know, it pretty is true to form with what the American people thinks about members, but they should know which members are willing to give them up in their own self-interest for a pay raise. It is despicable. You are about to shut the government down. But hours before you do so, you give yourself a pay raise.
Will suspend.
It's pathetic.
Will suspend.
Yes.
The chair will remind the members in this chamber, as a matter of decorum, direct your comments to the chair.
Will do.
And heed the gavel. Gentlelady may resume. Gentlelady reserves.
I reserve.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Molinaro, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
With hours to go before the potential shutdown of this federal government, we are posed with a single question. Vote yes to continue to provide services and support to our military, to our defense, to our communities, to law enforcement, or vote no and shut the government down. That's the question. And being told, by the way, for years that during the pandemic with the government shut down, that somehow people should just sort of fend for themselves, being told for years how great that was. We have an opportunity in this very moment to confront what is a real crisis for real people. Keep the government functioning. Continue to focus on appropriations. Drive down federal spending. But meet the needs and the expectations of the American people today. Vote yes to keep the government open. Vote no to shut the government down. I, on behalf of my constituents, will be voting yes to keep this government functioning. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Connecticut.
If I might, I'd like to read a letter that was sent by the Undersecretary of Defense, Michael McCord. And the letter was sent to the Speaker of the House as well as to the Senate majority and minority leaders, and it is just addressed to Leader Jeffries. I write to express the Department of Defense's deep concern with the absence of security assistance funding for Ukraine in the continuing resolution being considered in the House, or any similar continuing resolution that might be proposed. The Department of Defense is anxious to avoid a lapse in appropriations, but it is important that a CR protect our security interests and uphold our commitments and our values. As you know, the Department has been providing vital security assistance to Ukraine since Russia's unprovoked invasion in February 2022. Thanks to the bipartisan support of the Congress, it is just as vital today that we continue that support. Today, DoD has exhausted nearly all available security assistance funding for Ukraine. We are already out of funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, one of the 2 security assistance tools we have. The other funding tool we need are those funds provided to replenish our military's inventories for the weapons and supplies we provided to support Ukraine in their fight via drawdown. We have only $1.6 billion remaining of the $25.9 billion that the Congress has provided. We have already been forced to slow down the replenishment of our own forces to hedge against an uncertain funding future, our own forces. Failure to replenish our military services on a timely basis could harm our military's readiness. Without additional funding now, we would have to delay or curtail assistance to meet Ukraine's urgent requirements, including for air defense and ammunition, that are critical and urgent now as Russia prepares to conduct a winter offensive and continues its bombardment of Ukrainian cities. For example, a lack of USAI funding now will delay contracting actions that could negatively impact the Department's ability to purchase essential additional 150-millimeter artillery and critical munitions essential for the success of Ukraine's armed forces. This ammunition is critical to sustaining Ukraine's armed forces, including for their ongoing counteroffensive. An inability to ensure timely procurement and deliveries could undermine essential Ukrainian operations to retake additional territory or defend against potential future Russian offensives. It would also affect our ability to support Ukraine's land forces, including obstacle breaching equipment, sustainment of previously provided small unmanned aerial systems, systems to detect, analyze, and locate adversary signals, and demolitions equipment. It would affect training, maintenance, and sustainment of the equipment we have previously provided, exportability efforts, spare parts, and other activities to ensure the Ukrainian armed forces receive a full capacity. A funding cutoff would also send a negative signal to our defense industrial base, which we have asked to step up munitions production across the country, resulting in increased defense capacity, and higher employment. We cannot afford to throw that progress away. In fact, we are counting on it to implement our national defense strategy. It is important to note that from workers supporting Stinger and AMRAAM manufacturing in Arizona to factories producing components for Patriot, interceptors, and GMLRS in Arkansas, this funding is strengthening the American economy and creating hundreds of new American jobs. Some have suggested that the department could still execute the mission and support Ukraine's needs if it were given permission to transfer funds from inside a short-term CR from our own needs to fund more security assistance. I want to be clear. The department does not support that approach, which will create an unacceptable risk to us. Under a CR, the department will be operating at a level approximately $25 billion below our budget request for fiscal year 2024, which was and is consistent with the Fiscal Responsibility Act of funding levels. The bottom line is we cannot sustain adequate levels of Ukraine assistance with transfer authority only. Delays to additional funding would also be perceived by Ukraine as a sign of wavering U.S. support and likely as a betrayal of our previous commitments. Allies and partners are also unlikely to sustain their increased level of support without clear, continuing U.S. leadership. As you know, Secretary Austin successfully engages over 50 nations every month to press for sustained support. It is crucial that the United States continues to lead this global coalition, and we need the resources to underwrite our leadership role. The Department appreciates your leadership on this vital matter, and I sent an identical letter to the Speaker of the House as well as Senate Majority and Minority Leaders, Michael McCord, the Undersecretary for Defense. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Despito, for 2 minutes.
Well, gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Speaker, while I appreciate the eloquent remarks from my colleague from Connecticut, I am from New York. And today we ask ourselves a very basic question. Are we voting and supporting to keep the United States of America open, to make sure our government moves forward, or are we drawing the line in the sand, putting Ukraine over the greatest country in the world, the United States of America? My colleague from Connecticut also mentioned that there was only 15 minutes given to her conference. I find it startling that you need more than just seconds to make a vote in support of keeping this government and supporting the United States of America. This is not, today, a Democrat issue. It is not a Republican issue. This is an American issue. And today we should all stand on this floor and support this continuing resolution in keeping this government open.
Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I speak to the issue of Ukraine, I thought I might read the American citizens the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. Now, if you're watching this, I'm sorry that you don't have something better to do on a Saturday, but you need to know who's telling you the truth and who's not telling you the truth. Recently, you heard my colleague from Connecticut tell you that the Republican bill has a pay raise for members of Congress. It's simply not true. And if it did, it would be unconstitutional. And if the Senate bill changes the compensation for members of Congress, then it too is unconstitutional. Again, the 27th Amendment, word for word, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. They are simply grasping at straws. They have intended to shut down the government from the start. With regard to Ukraine funding, I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I also happen to be on the Intelligence Committee, and I support the mission in Ukraine. But it is not a U.S.-led mission. It is a mission that the United States is participating in, and this continuing resolution will not do anything to hinder what the United States is doing with regard to Ukraine. We need to vote for this continuing resolution. We need to keep the United States government open. We need to keep the DOD funded and our soldiers funded, and disregard totally what you're hearing from the other side. They are grasping at straws, making excuses, and telling flat-out lies about member compensation as an excuse to vote against this piece of legislation. Let's keep the government open. Vote for this bill.
From Connecticut.
Continue to reserve.
She continues to reserve. Gentlelady from Texas. Gentlelady from Texas with 10 minutes remaining.
I yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We deal with a lot of complicated issues in this House. This is not one of them. Let's be very clear. 12 hours from now, the federal government shuts down if we don't act. This bill will fund the federal government for 45 days with a clean continuing resolution with just the addition of disaster funding. That's all this is. Let's not get too complicated. We are out of time. We either vote yes to keep the federal government open, or we will shut the government down. Again, this is not very complicated. We either vote to keep the government open by voting yes, or vote no and take responsibility for shutting down the federal government. This could not be simpler. This could not be easier. The American people are wise and they get it. It's hard to believe that some members of Congress would be confused on something so easy. I yield back.
Back. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I continue to reserve.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield to the gentleman from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Iowa is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding to me. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this continuing resolution to responsibly keep the government open for 45 days. Shutting down the government should be a last resort. My priority has always been to protect and represent my constituents to the best of my ability, and I cannot justify shutting down our entire government over obscure policy decisions. Government shutdowns have real consequences on American lives. You know, my dad was an enlisted master sergeant in the Air Force. My mom had a GED. They both worked. My dad often extra jobs on the weekend. I grew up watching my dad at the kitchen table calculate how long it would take to mail a bill so that the bill would get there after his one single paycheck a month came in. Every single month I watched that. He knew exactly how many days it took. A lapse in pay for these individuals means going without food. These are real people that would be affected by the political games both sides in Washington are playing. To our nearly 10,000 hardworking Iowans in our district who work for the federal government and are out of work, from heads of department to law enforcement officers to cafeteria workers, To the Iowa National Guard men and women who are protecting our southern border, I want to assure you that I will remain steadfastly committed to keeping the government open, because at the end of the day, I know your bills are still due. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I will continue to reserve.
She continues to reserve. Gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Amedee.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the chairman of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee on Appropriations, which has very specific jurisdiction over member pay, I just want to say plainly and unambiguously, in the 70 pages in this thing, directly or indirectly, there is nothing that will lead to a member pay raise. That will be next week, where it is appropriately considered on the floor in terms of cost of living or other things on the floor. Yes, I will.
Thank you very, very much, my friend. I appreciate it. I would make reference to page 7 of the 71-page document. And in the Senate bill, I might add, they include a line that says that the Senate bill includes the blocking or the prohibition on a member pay raise. That has been dropped from the bill that has just been proposed.
Well,
so in fact,
reclaiming my time,
Gentleman
with all due respect, the definition of a CR is you go forward. There is nothing to block in going forward with last year's. That language still applies. Thank you, good morning, and God bless America.
I think the gentleman yielded back his time. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to the Democratic whip, Congresswoman Clark.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the ranking member. We've just received a 71-page bill that is about keeping open our federal government, something that Democrats have been pushing for months. We are asking for 90 minutes to be able to read this bill and come to the floor with an informed vote. That has been denied. We have serious trust issues. So at this point in time, I am making a motion to adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a call of the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote. The ayes are 0. The nays are 427. The motion is not adopted. House will be in order. Members are advised to clear the well, clear the aisle, take your conversations from the floor. Remind members of the House that at the time of the motion to adjourn was demanded, we were debating H.R. 5860. The time remaining for debate is 6 minutes on the majority side, 5 minutes on the minority side. Debate will resume on H.R. 5860, and the gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I continue to reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Who claims time? Gentlelady from Texas.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentlelady's prepared to close. Gentlelady
We are
from
not
Connecticut?
prepared to close.
They're trying to get Jeffries here to do.
Gentlelady from Connecticut, you're recognized.
Just so I can reiterate what I had said earlier, and we now have really the language in both the Senate bill and in the House bill. This, and it's really not so clean a continuing resolution as it has been portrayed. This strikes the member pay prohibition, in effect giving members a pay raise. Let me just explain. If you have a copy of the bill, which is on page 7, in the Senate bill, there is language that the legislative branch appropriations bill, what division it is, et cetera, section 6, is provides really what it does is the Senate bill prohibits the movement toward a member pay raise. Now, what the House Republicans have done is page 7, line 13, is what they do, they just drop that part of the language that comes from the Senate bill. In essence, what they have done is to provide themselves with a pay raise. I think I would just, I would ask you, I understand what you're saying, but what you need to do is, I don't know if, you haven't given us time to read the 71 pages. I'm hopeful that all of you have had the opportunity to read the 71 pages.
The gentlelady will suspend. Once again, the chair would like to remind his colleagues that in keeping with the proper decorum on the floor, please direct your comments to the chair. Gentlelady will. Gentlelady, may
Thank
resume.
you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the distinguished Democratic leader, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady. Thank the distinguished gentlelady from Connecticut, Rosa DeLauro, for her leadership, all of my colleagues in government. I rise today to have a conversation with the American people. And so strap in, because this may take a little while. We want to talk about why we are here at this moment on the brink of a shutdown that was entirely unavoidable and has been brought to us by the extreme MAGA Republicans who have decided that rather than pursue the normal legislative process of trying to find common ground, not as Democrats or independents or Republicans, but as Americans, rather than try to pursue policy achievements through the normal legislative process, that they want to threaten the American people with a shutdown, to try to drive your extreme agenda down the throats of the American people. Why are we here at this moment on the brink of a catastrophic shutdown that will hurt everyday Americans, hurt children, hurt families, hurt older Americans, hurt veterans, and hurt the economy? Why are we at this moment? When from the very beginning we have said that there's an opportunity to come together in a bipartisan way consistent with the spending agreement that House Republicans themselves negotiated. And from the beginning of this process, we've said nothing more, nothing less. Simply keep your word with respect to the agreement that you negotiated. And just so that the American people understand, just so that the American people understand what we are talking about when we say simply that an agreement was negotiated. How did we get to this point? Well, heading into the 117th this Congress, we said that we are willing to find common ground with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle whenever and wherever possible, in the best interests of the American people. Govern in a bipartisan way, in the same way that we governed in the previous Congress, where we passed bill after bill after bill to make life better for the American people. And so many of those legislative efforts, whether it was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, where we created millions of good-paying jobs for hard-working, everyday Americans, to fix our crumbling bridges, roads, tunnels, our airports, our sewer and water systems, our mass transportation systems. And it was bipartisan. Largely Democratic in the House, but bipartisan. We passed gun safety legislation for the first time in 30 years. Why? Because we believe that we should do something about the gun violence epidemic in the United States of America with the fierce urgency of now. And not, as some of my colleagues want to do, unleash weapons of war that are not used to hunt deer, they're used to hunt human beings and shred children. And so we worked in a bipartisan way to pass the Safer Communities Act, to make progress for the American people. And then we worked on the CHIPS and Science Act that will bring domestic manufacturing jobs back home to the United States of America, as opposed to our jobs moving in the other direction. And to invest in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, to ensure that our young people have the skills to succeed in the 21st century economy and are competitive to continue to elevate American exceptionalism. That was done in a bipartisan way. Now, there were some areas where our Republican colleagues refused to do what was right, in our view, for the American people. And that's why, in some instances, we needed to just act, to put people over politics. People over politics. And so that's what we did with the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. But our bipartisan track record continues. We stood up for the men and women who have served this country and who were exposed to burn pits or toxic substances or Agent Orange. And through the PACT Act, under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Mark Takano, we stood up for our veterans to ensure that millions of them would get the health care that they deserve. And we got the PACT Act over the finish line. Once again, it was bipartisan in nature. We understood that there were grave threats to our democracy because of what occurred with the former President of the United States of America, who incited a violent insurrection and tried to potentially use some loopholes within the Electoral Count Act to effectively steal the election, undermine the principle of free and fair elections, halt the peaceful transfer of power. And so we held a committee under the leadership of Chairman Benny Thompson, who did an incredible job of presenting the stakes to the American people. And so, the January 6th committee explored the consequences of what happens when one individual and people who blindly follow them could undermine the very fabric of our democracy. It's important to note the January 6th committee was also bipartisan in nature. It was bipartisan, and every single witness that was presented worked with the former president. And there's still more that needs to be done in that regard, but one of the legislative results of the January 6th committee's wonderful presentation and exploration was that we passed reform to the Electoral Count Act to strengthen the institution of our democracy as part of the principle that we will never again allow a single individual sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to try to undermine American democracy. We won't do it. And that bill was bipartisan in nature. We also passed the American Rescue Plan at a moment of great crisis, the very beginning of the previous Congress. In the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic that cost so many lives, so much pain, so much suffering, so much death. And so we moved decisively under the leadership of President Biden to pass the American Rescue Plan, which put shots in arms, money in pockets, and kids back in school. We passed the child tax credit as part of that, that reduced child poverty in America by half. By half. And not a single Republican would join us as part of the effort to make sure that the American dream is alive and well in every single zip code. And we reduced poverty, and these were things that were done for everyone, every single American, regardless of zip code. Urban America, rural America, exurban America, suburban America, small town America, the heartland of America, Appalachia. We're committed to putting people over politics. That's what we were able to do with the American Rescue Plan, and allowed the United States of America to emerge as the strongest economy of any advanced economy in the world. And that wasn't a guarantee. And we know we have more work to do. We know we have more work to do. And we want to get to work. But instead of getting to work, on behalf of the American people, solving problems, joining and partnering with us in a manner that's designed to find common ground, extreme MAGA Republicans have been marching us to a dangerous government shutdown, which we'll get to in a moment. But we ended the previous Congress by passing the Inflation Reduction Act, striking a dramatic blow against the climate crisis, setting our planet on a sustainable trajectory forward, the largest investment in combating the climate crisis in the history of the world, because we recognize that these extreme weather events will not go away on their own. And America is leading, thanks to our Speaker Emerita and House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and President Joe Biden. In that legislation, we also addressed the issue of health care affordability, because we understand that the American people are dealing with grave challenges as it relates to their cost of living. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, we began to address that in a serious way. Strengthen the Affordable Care Act, lowering health care costs, and driving down the high price of life-saving prescription drugs for millions of Americans, including by taking the price of insulin, which prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act would cost the average American family about $4,000 a year, and we drove that down to $35 a month. And we're just getting started. And so that's a track record coming into this Congress. And as the American people are suffering from what has been characterized as a Republican civil war, and apparently it's because a handful of the more extreme members on the other side of the aisle have concluded that what's necessary is to try to hijack the institution, to jam their right-wing ideological views down the throats of the American people, because they understand that otherwise these extreme policies cannot be achieved throughout the normal legislative process. But we're supposed to believe that the chaos, the dysfunction, the extremism is largely a result of the narrowness of the Republican majority. We had the same exact majority, extremely narrow, in the other side of the aisle, and instead of chaos, dysfunction, and extremism, we got things done for the American people. Same exact majority, under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi and Jim Clyburn and Steny Hoyer. So that's the context coming into the moment that we're in right now. Historic dysfunction that we've seen. So we're on the brink of a government shutdown, and at the 11th hour, legislation is dropped on the American people. And we're told that you have 5 or 10 minutes to evaluate legislation that is more than 70 pages long, and expected simply to trust the word of our extreme MAGA Republican colleagues. The American people deserve better. They deserve better. And so we're working through evaluating that legislation on behalf of the American people. and when we've had time to evaluate the bill that was dropped on the American people at the 11th hour, immediately after what took place yesterday on the floor of the House, where extreme MAGA Republicans put on the floor a continuing resolution that imposed 30% or more draconian cuts on the American people, including cutting the Social Security Administration by 30%, devastate Social Security and the ability of the administration to administer it on behalf of older Americans in this country. We need time to evaluate whether in this bill that you just dropped upon the American people at the 11th hour, does it try to cut Social Security? Because that's what you tried to do yesterday. We need a little time to evaluate whether you are trying to slash public school funding. Why are we concerned about whether the Republican majority is trying to slash public school funding? Because you put forth a bill that did just that. Yesterday would devastate the ability of American children all across the country to be able to learn in a manner that gives them the best opportunity to succeed and pursue the American dream. Some versions of the Republican spending bills would slash Title I funding, which goes to the most vulnerable children amongst us, by 80%, effectively shut down public education in many parts of this country. I think it's a reasonable thing for House Democrats, on behalf of the American people, to have time to evaluate what you are trying to do with public education in a bill that House Republicans dropped on the American people at the 11th hour. We also are very concerned that from the very beginning of this Congress, you've had an objective to criminalize abortion care and to impose or march us toward a nationwide ban. And we want the American people to understand that on this side of the aisle, we don't believe that our colleagues on the Republican side should threaten a government shutdown as part of their effort to criminalize abortion care. That shouldn't happen. That should not happen. But that's what you were trying to do in a defense bill that you just passed this week. So we needed an opportunity to evaluate on the four corners of a bill that you dropped on us, Mr. Chair, that the Republican majority dropped on us at the 11th hour, what it does to reproductive freedom. I think that's what the American people would want us to do. And let us be clear to the American people. House Democrats believe in a woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decisions, period, full stop. And the Republican majority wants to undermine reproductive freedom. So we are trying to evaluate in a bill dropped on the American people at the 11th hour whether anything in the four corners of this bill would undermine reproductive freedom. Now, earlier in the year, my Republican colleagues threatened to default on America's debt, which connects to the moment that we're in right now because it ultimately resulted in Republicans agreeing to top-line spending numbers. And so it's part of what has brought us to this moment, because an agreement was reached in May to avoid any shutdown drama by setting top-line spending numbers at the insistence of House Republicans, who then went into the Oval Office with President Joe Biden, who was negotiating in good faith, arrived at top-line spending numbers. Bill was presented on the House floor. More than 300 members of Congress voted for it, including 149 Republicans. A majority in the Senate that was bipartisan in nature, sent to President Biden's desk, signed into law, setting top-line spending numbers as part of an effort to avoid a reckless government shutdown. And it took less than a week for the Republican majority to break its word in the agreement that House Republicans themselves negotiated, which is what leads us to this moment right now. The nerve of even threatening a catastrophic default in and of itself highlights the extremism that has permeated this chamber from the beginning of this Congress on January 3rd. Because the full faith and credit of the United States of America and protecting it is a constitutional responsibility that we all have. And by the way, when Democrats were in the majority and someone was in the White House from the other side of the political aisle, someone who we strongly disagreed with, the former president, we raised the debt ceiling 3 times. No gamesmanship, no partisanship, no showmanship. We raised it 3 times, which is why that's simply what should have occurred this time around. But as part of extracting policy changes that the American people don't support, we were threatened with defaulting on our debt for the first time in American history, would have crashed the economy, sent the stock market spiraling downward, triggered a job-killing recession. And under the leadership of President Biden, we reached an agreement to avoid a catastrophic default. In that agreement, we protected Social Security, protected Medicare, protected Medicaid, protected veterans, protected public education, protected public safety, protected our efforts to combat the climate crisis, and protected the American people. And as part of that, we reached top-line spending numbers that Republicans negotiated and then immediately broke the agreement to bring us to this point. And that's very unfortunate, because all of this could have been avoided. We have a bill in the Senate that shortly would have ended the government shutdown if, in fact, as we've consistently asked for, this bipartisan spending agreement emerges from the Senate, makes its way over to the House, and if you put the bipartisan spending agreement emerging from the Senate on the floor of the House of Representatives and allow for an up or down vote, it will pass, and the extreme MAGA Republican shutdown threat would end. That's the way to proceed. So why can't my Republican colleagues commit to doing just that? Is this really a serious effort to end a government shutdown threat when it's in the DNA of many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to shut down the government? It's not hyperbole. Let's just check the historic record. 1990s, Republicans shut the government down twice when Bill Clinton was president. The ransom demand at the time was, we want to slash and burn Medicaid. End Medicare as the American people know it. And unless that were to happen, we were told by Republicans that they would shut down the government. And that's exactly what happened twice in the 1990s in order to try to slash and burn Medicaid and adversely impact Medicare. It's in the DNA of House Republicans. How do we know that? Well, in 2013, American people were forced to deal with another reckless, dangerous government shutdown for 14 days. House Republicans shut down the government. Why was the government shut down in 2013? Because the demand was made, inherently unreasonable, that President Obama should repeal the Affordable Care Act, a signature legislative accomplishment that has been a force for good in the United States of America. And we declined politely to take away health care from millions of Americans. We declined politely to allow House Republicans to impose a situation in America where more than 100 million people would have lost their protection for pre-existing conditions. We declined to allow House Republicans to impose an age tax on older Americans, which would have dramatically increased health care costs. And because we declined to do those things, House Republicans chose to shut the government down in 2013 for 14 days. It's in the House Republican DNA. And then in 2018, 2019, we faced the longest government shutdown in American history. 35 days of devastation visited upon the American people. Unnecessarily so. What was the extreme ransom demand at that particular point in time? The demand was to waste billions of dollars of taxpayer money on the former president's ineffective medieval border wall, which, by the way, he said Mexico would pay for. And then you turned around, the House majority at the time turned around and tried to stick the American taxpayer with a bill, an ineffective solution to the issues around immigration that we should necessarily confront. And so because we declined respectfully to pay that ransom note and stick the American people with billions and billions of dollars for an ineffective border wall that the previous president promised Mexico would pay for, because we declined, you shut the government down for 35 days. It's in your DNA. The interesting thing about that government shutdown is that while we had taken the majority in January of 2019, the government shutdown started in late December. And so, in other words, the government shutdown started with a Republican in the White House and Republicans in the majority in the House and in the Senate. You shut yourselves down at that particular moment. It's in the DNA. And so that is the backdrop. That is the context for how we arrive at this moment. After the district work period, throughout the month of August, we came back to the Congress, ready, willing, and able to get things done for the American people, to find common ground, to put people over politics, which is what we are committed to doing every single day we're here in Washington. And when we came back in September, that's what House Democrats were prepared to do. Now, we were told that to the extent any illegitimate impeachment inquiry would be launched, that it would be done so only with a serious up or down vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. That's what we were told by House Republican leadership. That's not what happened. Instead of coming back to Washington in September, knowing we were faced with the possibility of an extreme MAGA Republican government shutdown, and being laser focused on finding the common ground necessary to fund the government in a way that protects the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people, instead of doing that, without a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, House leadership announces an illegitimate impeachment inquiry. No evidence of wrongdoing against the president, no evidence of an impeachable offense, no evidence that any high crimes or misdemeanors were committed by the president, no evidence that the president broke the law. How do we know this? Your own witnesses told the American people that 2 days ago in a hearing that House Republicans called. So for 3 weeks, instead of focusing on solving problems for hard-working American taxpayers, House Republicans launched an illegitimate impeachment inquiry when House Republican witnesses have now testified before the American people that no evidence exists to justify impeaching the current president. And so that is part of the context of why we're here. House Republicans wasting time doing the bidding of the former president, the insurrectionist in chief, who demanded an illegitimate impeachment inquiry be open. And as opposed to working together to find the common ground to meet the needs of the American people, you've been wasting time and taxpayer dollars on a reckless political stunt. That's why we're at the brink of the government shutting down right now. That was week one when we came back, the week of September 11th. What happened in week two? Week two, the week of September 18th, House Republicans, my colleagues, decided that you were going to try to jam extreme right-wing policies down the throats of the American people. Strip away reproductive freedom, criminalize abortion care, bully the LGBTQ community, cut public education, cut public safety, cut affordable housing programs, cut the ability for veterans to receive the nutritional assistance that they needed. So week two, you decided, the House majority, Mr. Chairman, decided to go to the floor to pass bills that would do nothing to make life better for everyday Americans, do nothing to avoid a catastrophic government shutdown, do nothing to find common ground in a bipartisan way. But during the week of September 18th, the decision was made to try to jam extreme right-wing policies down the throats of the American people. And not a single bill was passed because House Republicans had an inability to get your act together with each other. Colorful words were used. I won't use them on the floor. They're in the public domain as part of a Republican civil war, shooting at each other, fighting each other. Let me make something clear. House Democrats are here to fight for the American people, to fight for the American people. That's what we should be doing, not fighting each other as part of a Republican civil war. But last week, time was wasted my House Republican colleagues fighting each other in what has been described as a Republican civil war. Colorful language used not by Democrats to describe what was taking place on the other side of the aisle, used by House Republicans to describe each other. And I won't call out any individual members on the other side of the aisle, but former members, including a former speaker. Paul Ryan, a good man, disagreed with him on a whole host of issues, but believed in the institution, made the observation that House Republicans are dysfunctional, need to get your act together. That's Paul Ryan, former speaker. And that same sentiment was echoed by current House Republican members. So last week, you wasted time fighting each other as opposed to finding the common ground necessary to reach a bipartisan spending agreement. The chair, former chair, top Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro, has made clear from the very beginning she was ready to sit down and talk to her Republican counterpart anytime, any place, ready, willing, and able to find bipartisan common ground. But we couldn't find a partner on the other side, and so we proceeded in conversation with Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans and the Biden administration, all in alignment in a strongly bipartisan bill to avert a government shutdown earlier this week that passed in a motion procedurally to advance the legislation 77 to 19, strongly bipartisan. And we were a part of those conversations, thanks to Rosa DeLauro. That's a bill that would avoid a government shutdown and meet the needs of the American people in every single way, and give us another 45 days or so to work through the normal appropriations process and reach common ground. But instead of partnering with House Democrats, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, and the Biden administration, House Republicans decided to go it alone. Fight a civil war. Stand on an island on your own. So last week, nothing happened on the floor of the House of Representatives. And that brings us to this week. This week, we returned earlier and had every opportunity. We continue to say, we want to partner with our Republican colleagues to find the common ground necessary to meet the needs of the American people and avoid a catastrophic government shutdown that will hurt everyday Americans, hurt children, hurt families, hurt the middle class, hurt all those who aspire to be part of the middle class, hurt working families, hurt veterans, hurt the poor, the sick, the afflicted, hurt the least, the lost, and the left behind. We've said from the very beginning that we were ready, willing, and able to find the bipartisan common ground to meet the needs of the American people and avoid a catastrophic government shutdown. But instead, my Republican colleagues spent this week peddling more chaos, more dysfunction, and more extremism, trying to jam extreme right-wing policies down the throats of the American people, cutting Social Security, slashing public school funding, criminalizing abortion care, including in the Department of Defense bill that House Republicans advanced earlier this week, to restrict military service women from being able to travel in order to seek reproductive health care, and threaten a government shutdown unless the American people were to be forced to agree with a policy that they don't support. We spent this week doing things like that. Yesterday, a bill brought to the House floor to cut spending by 30% or more in a manner that would do things like take food out of the mouths of women, infants, and children. We will never let that happen. Not now, not ever. Not in America. We will never let that happen. But that's one of the extreme right-wing policies that my Republican colleagues spent this week threatening to do, taking us to the brink of a government shutdown. Now, from the very beginning, there was a clear path forward because a spending agreement was reached in May that everyone in this town agreed to abide by as a matter of law. House Democrats, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, and President Biden. So why have we spent the last several weeks here in the House of Representatives trying to break that agreement and threaten a reckless government shutdown, which, by the way, will have catastrophic consequences for the American people? We want the American people to know that we are going to do everything possible to stop extreme MAGA Republicans from shutting down the government. We are fighting on their behalf to put people over politics. That's why we're here. That's why we're making this fight. And we want to do it in a bipartisan way. So we're in the process of evaluating the legislation that was dropped on the American people at the 11th hour. And once we conclude that expeditious review of the four corners of the legislation, we can make a decision as to the best path forward. When we've said all week that the only path forward is a bipartisan one. There's a bipartisan bill working its way through the Senate right now. Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans coming together to meet the needs of the American people. So we're evaluating the four corners of the bill to see if it does what's necessary as part of our effort to fight for things like lower costs and better paying jobs and safer communities, building a healthy economy for hardworking American taxpayers. Why? Because as House Democrats, we're committed to an economy that is built from the middle out and the bottom up, not the top down. Not the top down. And so we're in the process now of evaluating whether there's anything in the four corners of this bill that would impose upon the American people the trickle-down economic scheme that has been such a disaster for the American middle class and for all those who aspire to be part of the middle class. I think the American people deserve an opportunity for their elected representatives, Democrats and Republicans, to evaluate the legislation that is in front of us. That's the least that can be done. When we know for decades, House Republicans and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have imposed big tax cuts that benefit only the wealthiest amongst us and undermine the ability of the American people to truly pursue the American dream. It was done most recently in 2017. The House Republican majority signature legislative accomplishment was passing the GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%. And if at the end of the day, this is all about fiscal responsibility, we want our Republican colleagues to explain why in a bill that benefit only a handful of Americans did you stick the American people with $2 trillion worth of debt? Because the GOP tax scam was not paid for at all. And so, House Republicans dropped a bill on the American people at the 11th hour earlier today. And all we're simply saying is that we want time to evaluate whether there's anything within the four corners of that bill that would try to impose some trickle-down economic scheme. I've come to the conclusion over the years that trickle-down economics means only one thing for everyday Americans. You may get a trickle, but you're guaranteed to stay down. That's what trickle-down economics is all about. So at the end of the day, we need to just evaluate where we are. Because House Republicans started this Congress by saying any bill that is brought before the People's House will be done so in a manner that allows for at least 72 hours of review. That was the House Republican policy, 72 hours of review. Like many other things that have been broken promises throughout this do-nothing Republican Congress, you promised the American people would have 72 hours to review any bill brought before the American people, and you dropped this bill at the 11th hour today and gave the American people minutes to evaluate it. That's unacceptable. It's un-American. It's unreasonable. The American people deserve better. The American people deserve better. Because at the end of the day, what we are endeavoring to do is to try to figure out where we are at on behalf of our quest to lift up the great American dream for the middle class and all those who aspire to be part of the middle class, to do things that are pro-American, pro-worker, pro-labor union, pro-entrepreneurial, pro-small business, pro-job creation, consistent with our views that in America, when you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself and for your family. Educate your children, purchase a home, and one day retire with grace and dignity. Is that too much to ask? That's what we're fighting for on behalf of the American people. And all we want is time. Just a handful of moments to be able to evaluate. Is there anything within the bill that was dropped on the American people at the 11th hour, notwithstanding the fact that the American people were promised 72 hours for any bill, let alone consequential legislation? We just want to be able to evaluate within the four corners of the agreement where things are at in terms of uplifting that basic American principle. And so, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my remarks, House Democrats continue to stand ready to find common ground with our Republican colleagues whenever and wherever possible. However, we will oppose Republican extremism whenever necessary. We will oppose any efforts to cut Social Security and Medicare. We will oppose any efforts to slash public school funding. We will oppose any efforts to undermine American democracy. We will oppose any efforts to flood our communities with weapons of war. We will oppose any efforts to undermine the progress being made on the climate crisis. We will oppose any efforts to undermine the great American dream. We will oppose any efforts to undercut public education. We will oppose any efforts to walk away from the people who keep us safe at our border and around the United States of America. We will oppose any efforts to undermine the ability of the middle class to continue to thrive in the United States of America. And all we're doing is making sure that we can assess the four corners of the legislation that is before us, avoid a catastrophic government shutdown, put people over politics, and make sure that we can continue the great American dream. That you don't undermine freedom. You don't undermine reproductive freedom. You don't undermine the things that are necessary for every single American to thrive in every zip code, throughout the land, in urban America, in rural America, in suburban America, in small-town America, in the heartland of America, in Appalachia. That's all we're doing. And when we complete our review, we'll come back to the floor, we'll make a decision, and as Democrats, we'll continue to put people over politics and continue America's long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Without objection, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart, will control the time for the majority. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from the state of Nevada, Mr. Amodei.
Gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to my colleague from Florida, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's been a complaint about...
In order. Members are advised to take their conversations from the floor. Gentleman may resume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's been some indication that of concern because the bill on the floor lacks language to prohibit a cost of living increase that doesn't exist, and that was not given, and which has no appropriation in the existing fiscal year budget. Normally, that would be the end of the discussion. However, I guess, being generous here, out of an abundance of caution and respect for those bill drafting experts in the Senate, fixing that to include the Senate's genius language in this measure is something that's imminently doable in short order, unless it becomes midnight, because we have to have a couple of more September State of the Unions. Therefore, even though it was not included in our legislation, even though there is no existing COLA or appropriation for it, if that's the only thing, I'm going to say that real slowly, if that's the only thing that's wrong, then it's imminently fixable for that belt and suspenders insurance policy for those who would support the bill but for the lack of that language. We shall see. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
He yields back his time. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Mr. Speaker, I am prepared to close. Okay.
Gentlelady's prepared to close. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, may I first inquire how much time I have left?
Gentleman has 4 1/4 minutes remaining. Gentlelady from Connecticut has 2 1/2 minutes remaining.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would actually like to ask unanimous consent if I could extend the time per side for an additional 10 minutes to speak. We have further people.
Is there objection?
Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. 10 and 10.
Reserve. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, thank you for indulgence. I would like to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized with 12 1/2 minutes remaining. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, House Republicans have shown they are unwilling and unable to govern. Some have shown they are willing and able to abandon our allies. Russian tyranny and aggression threaten more than just Ukraine's borders. We learned in Georgia and we learned in Crimea, if you stand by while Russia takes an inch, they will take a mile. Vladimir Putin must be held to account for upending Europe's security in peacetime for a pointless and bloody war which has disrupted energy markets and triggered food insecurity around the world. We must be clear about what this means. Plain and simple, this is appeasement, like the world experienced in 1938 and which led to a cascading, murderous result. Ukraine's fight for democracy and sovereignty requires decisive action and absolute support from the free world. We must act like the leaders of the free world. We must not abandon our position as the world's beacon of democratic values. We must not surrender our global influence to Russia, China, or any group that threatens democracies. Members of this body have come together again and again to reaffirm our commitment to helping Ukraine defend itself against vicious invasion. Let us keep the government open and let us proceed to make sure that we do not abandon our allies. I yield back.
Does the gentlelady yield or reserve?
I reserve. Thank you.
Reserves. Gentleman from Florida with 14 1/4 minutes remaining.
Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Chairman. I would now like to yield to another fellow appropriator, gentleman from California, Mr. Valadao.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I'd like to thank my friend from Florida for the time. Mr. Speaker, I think today we're at a really important moment in our history. Obviously, we're all frustrated. Myself as an appropriator, we've gone through this process. There was an effort to bring bills up sooner. We all would have liked those to have come up sooner. But playing games and dragging this out and watching members drag the process out even further than it needs to be is not helpful. Ultimately, we need to get this passed. We need to get this over to the Senate as quickly as possible because the American people want us to get this done. There's a lot of efforts that need to move forward. We obviously need to continue the process of appropriating, and I think we've got a commitment now from leadership to keep us here over the next 2 weeks, which I think is the right thing to do, so that we can finish the appropriations bills. We've done quite a bit. Obviously, moving the 4 bills off the House floor is a huge step for us. We've got 2 more to move out of committee, and I think we'll be moving that soon enough. But the reality is that we need to finish our work. And these 45 days will give us the ability to do that. It makes a difference for the American people. It makes a difference for us here in Congress. And sadly, it's something we need to do. But ultimately, we've got a vote here in a few minutes. And I ask that all my colleagues support the CR and get us through those 45 days so we can finish our work. And Mr. Speaker, I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Speaker.
Time.
I would reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to note here that, first of all, I'm very interested that there was a rereading of the bill as it came from the House and from the Senate, and that there is a view that it needs to be reviewed in some way because, in fact, as the bill stands, that there is a pay raise. That is being done. In addition to which, there is student loan efforts that are thwarted as well, making it more difficult for about 44 of 45 million borrowers to be able to get the kinds of services that they need. But I really want to make the point of, I have had the opportunity to chair the Appropriations Committee for 2 years. And for those 2 years, and with a, I think, 3 or 4 person majority, that with the assistance of colleagues in the House and in the Senate, and in last December, it was honestly just in the Senate, because House Republicans refused to participate in the negotiations, I think there were very few in the continuing resolution that we put forward, Republicans, who voted for a continuing resolution. I think, if I recall the number precisely, it was 9. But it allowed us to be able to hammer out the bills over the next several weeks until December. At that juncture, what we did was we came together, we hammered out the bills, we made sure that no one got everything that they wanted, but we could pass the bill. Now I move forward to what happened in last May and last June, when there was a budget agreement that was hammered out by the President and by the Speaker of the House. And to be very honest with you, I did not vote for that budget agreement. I would have never let this nation default, but I was very concerned about the harm that was going to be done to the people of this country through the appropriations process that was established by the majority, and that was to significantly cut $142 billion from the services that we provide, and that is education, it is mental health services, it is medical research services. All of that I viewed was going to be curtailed. But it is the law of the land. The law of the land, a civics. When the House passes something, the Senate passes something, the President signs the bill, it is the law of the land. But the Speaker of the House and Republicans in this House walked away from that agreement. And that is why we stand where we are today in this effort. I reserve.
The lady reserves her time. Members of the House, please take your conversations from the floor. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would now like to recognize the distinguished gentleman from New York, an amazing leader, Mr. D'Esposito, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just over 3 hours ago, we walked onto this floor with a plan and an opportunity to make sure that our government continues to work. But instead of moving that plan forward, we've spent the last hour hearing from a member on the other side of the aisle trying to gain C-SPAN ratings, and I believe a contest of how many times we could hear the term MAGA. We are here this afternoon to keep our government running. And over the last hour, I walked across the street to my office, taking calls from constituents on Long Island, in New York's 4th Congressional District, whose homes and cars were destroyed yesterday after a massive amount of rain and flooding. And these are individuals who are Democrats, who are Republicans. They're not calling because they're from a political party. They're calling because they're Americans. And they're pleading with us to keep our government open. They're pleading with us to do the job that we were sent here to do and to govern. And that's what we have the opportunity to do, is to cast a vote. Cast a vote today to continue to make sure that our government continues to run. that our government remains open, so we can do the job that we were sent here to do. And that's what I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Today, you're not making a partisan vote. You're making a vote in support of the United States of America. You're making a vote in support of residents back home who need our help. You're making a vote in support of moving this country forward. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
2 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would now like to yield to another great leader from the state of New York, Mr. Molinaro, for 30 seconds.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
Having listened for 45 minutes, Mr. Speaker, I'm amazed at and confused as to what exactly my colleague across the aisle thought we were doing in this very moment. In just moments, we have the opportunity to avert a federal government shutdown. It's a responsibility that we have to ensure that the people who work for this federal government have the supporting and the backing of those who employ them. It's critically important to the men and women who serve and sacrifice across the globe that they know that we have their backs. It's critically important that those in law enforcement, emergency response, and those all across this country know that in this moment we vote yes to keep this government functioning.
I reserve.
Gentlelady continues to reserve. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, and also I believe I made a mistake before when I may have called you Mr. Chairman when we're not in the Committee of the Whole. My mistake, Mr. Speaker. I would now ask unanimous consent that the text of H.R. 5860 as proposed to be adopted unless under suspension of the rules be modified by the amendment that I have placed at the desk. I apologize. And again, I've been making some technical mistakes, but I got it right, I think, now.
The clerk will report the modification.
Modification to H.R. 5860 offered by Mr. Diaz-Balart of Florida and Section 1019 of Division A before the period insert the following, comma, and Section 6 in the matter preceding Division A of Public Law 117-328.
Without objection, the modification is agreed to.
I am now prepared to close, and so therefore I will reserve.
Gentlelady from Connecticut. Are you prepared to close?
Yes.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I would once again really like to reiterate what I have been saying all along and which I said in the last several days. We have the opportunity to walking away where this House is overwhelmingly in the last 2 days, the majority has demonstrated that we want to provide support for Ukraine's self-defense. We had several amendments, a Biggs amendment, a Gates amendment, a Green amendment, all of which resulted in overwhelming support for Ukraine. I continue to believe that this is an appeasement strategy of the far right and, in fact, does not have a majority support in this body. But I believe that standing with our allies does have the support. And I would reiterate that our own Department of Defense, something that I believe my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have great regard for, listen to, support their efforts, increase funding for defense, care deeply about this issue of our national security and our ability to be able to defend our allies overseas. You all have a great affinity for this effort, and I applaud that. But that seems now to be being abandoned, and that the Department of Defense view, in the words of the Undersecretary, says that they cannot do without this funding. And I would remind you that they, in a very, very specific and poignant letter, lay out the bottom line is we cannot sustain adequate levels of Ukraine assistance with transfer authority only. And the delay to additional funding would be perceived by Ukraine as a sign of wavering U.S. support and likely as a betrayal of our previous commitments. The United States betraying our commitments to Ukraine is essentially the bottom line on this continuing resolution. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized with 10 1/2 minutes at his
Mr. Speaker,
disposal.
thank you, and thank you for a job well done. I just would like to remind everybody that before we can fund anything else, Ukraine, we have to start by funding the government of the United States of America. And we've been on the floor for a while now, and let me just boil it down to this, if I may, Mr. Speaker. If you want to shut down the government, and all that entails, and then there's an opportunity to do so by voting no. But if you want to keep the federal government working and open and allow the democratic process to proceed, then all of us have the opportunity to do so very simply, after all of the words are spoken, to just vote yes. It could not be simpler, Mr. Speaker. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 5860, as modified? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules will be followed by a 5-minute vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 335, the nays are 91. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Go to Vice. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal, which the Chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, in the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The Journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn. Sorry.
Where are the convening times?
Shh.
Where are the convening?
On the motion for the House to adjourn.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until noon on Monday, October 2nd, 2023, for morning hour debate.